Welcome back to Fusty Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. David had not seen Grace in 5 long years. Their separation had been bitter, filled with accusations, tears, and words they could never take back. Life had moved on, or so he thought, until that fateful afternoon in the bustling city mall. He had gone there with Ruth, his young wife, who had recently given birth to a beautiful baby girl named Abigail. To the world, David was a proud father and successful businessman, but inside, he carried scars that no one could see. He was still haunted by the ghost of Grace, the woman he had once loved yet treated so cruelly. While Ruth strolled ahead with Abigail in her stroller, David paused to check his phone, unaware that destiny had prepared a shocking twist just a few feet away. As he lifted his head, his eyes froze on a familiar figure. Grace stood there, radiant yet humble, holding the tiny hand of a boy who looked strikingly like David himself. His heart skipped a beat, his breath caught, and for a moment, the entire world around him faded into silence. Grace's face revealed a mix of shock and cold composure when she saw David. She tightened her grip on her son's hand, as if shielding him from a ghost of the past. Samuel, her 5-year-old boy, looked up innocently, unaware of the tension that rippled through the air. David's chest tightened as realization struck him like a thunderbolt. The boy had his own eyes, his jawline, and even the same stubborn dimple that appeared when he smiled. Questions and regrets bombarded his mind. Could this boy be his son? His world swirled with confusion as Ruth turned, unaware of what had just unfolded. Grace looked at David for only a second longer, then turned away, walking toward the exit with Samuel. David's feet felt nailed to the ground, his pride battling his desperate urge to chase after them. For the first time in years, he felt the crushing weight of regret. Years before that encounter, David and Grace's marriage had been filled with hope. They had met in church, fallen deeply in love, and shared countless dreams of building a family. But those dreams quickly soured when year after year, no child came. David, pressured by his family and his own ego, turned his frustration against Grace. He would hurl accusations late into the night, calling her barren, cursing her womb, and demanding answers she could not give. Grace, with her gentle heart, never raised her voice in return. She clung to her faith and whispered words of patience. "God's time is the best," she would often say, her voice steady even as tears wet her pillow. Yet David's impatience grew into cruelty. He refused medical tests, certain that the problem lay with her. He closed his ears to reason and opened his heart to bitterness, planting seeds that would eventually tear their union apart. Grace's stepsister, Ruth, lived with them during those years. She was younger, vibrant, and ambitious. Grace confided in her about the torment she faced, believing she could trust her. But Ruth had long harbored envy toward her sister. While Grace had married a wealthy and respectable man, Ruth lived in the shadows, yearning for that same kind of life. When Grace, desperate to please David, suggested that Ruth could marry him to help bring children into the family, Ruth at first feigned shock and righteousness. "What will people say?" she asked, pretending to resist. But secretly, the idea lit a fire in her heart. She imagined herself draped in luxury, adored as the one who gave David the family Grace could not. And so, what began as Grace's attempt at sacrifice would open the door to her greatest betrayal. Ruth's hesitation did not last long. With carefully crafted words, Grace convinced her that this was the only way to preserve their family. "At least if you give him a child, the shame will not destroy our home," Grace pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Ruth nodded, pretending to act out of compassion, but deep inside, she was thrilled. A few months later, the arrangements were made. David, blinded by his desire for an heir, barely hesitated when Grace presented the idea. His pride and impatience drowned out his conscience. He told himself that this was simply the practical solution, though in truth, it was also the doorway to escape the woman he had grown to despise. Soon enough, David and Ruth were married, and Grace found herself pushed into the background of her own life. Within months, Ruth's womb swelled with pregnancy, and David's joy knew no bounds. He flaunted his new wife in public, showered her with gifts, and paraded her belly as proof of his manhood. Grace's heart shattered with each passing day, but she kept her pain hidden, consoling herself with prayer. She hoped Ruth would honor the bond they once shared, but her illusions were shattered the moment Ruth's belly began to grow. Ruth became arrogant, dismissive, and cruel. She treated Grace like a servant, barking orders and belittling her at every turn. You couldn't give him what he needed, Ruth sneered one morning. Don't forget that I'm the real wife now. Grace could hardly believe the venom in her sister's words. The betrayal cut deeper than any insult David had ever thrown. Yet, Grace swallowed her pride and endured, believing that God would one day vindicate her. When Ruth finally gave birth, David was overwhelmed with joy. He named the baby girl Abigail and declared her the jewel of his life. He organized a lavish naming ceremony, inviting friends, relatives, and business partners to celebrate. Ruth basked in the glory, dressing in expensive fabrics and jewels, strutting about as though she were royalty. Grace, meanwhile, faded further into obscurity. She was made to serve guests at the ceremony, her once proud place in David's household reduced to that of a maid. People whispered behind her back, some pitying her, others mocking her apparent barrenness. She smiled weakly, holding back tears as she carried trays of food and drinks, while Ruth flaunted Abigail as though she were the ultimate prize. Over time, Ruth's true colors shone brighter. She no longer pretended to care for Grace. Instead, she ridiculed her openly, sometimes even in David's presence. To Grace's shock, David did nothing to defend her. Instead, he joined Ruth, often mocking his first wife in front of others. Grace's heart grew heavier with every insult, but she never retaliated. She poured her anguish into prayer, often spending long nights on her knees, crying out to God for deliverance. She prayed not only for herself but for Ruth, hoping her sister would one day realize the evil in her heart. But Ruth had no such intentions. She relished her position of power and promised herself she would one day push Grace out entirely, ensuring that she remained the only woman in David's life. The turning point came one morning when David, without warning, placed a set of papers in front of Grace. She looked down and froze. Divorce. Her hands trembled as she read the words, her vision blurred by tears. Sign it, David said coldly. Ruth stood behind him, a smirk tugging at her lips as she cradled Abigail. Grace's lips quivered. David, after everything, after all I have endured. You're casting me aside, she whispered. He sneered. You've been nothing but a burden. Ruth has given me a child, something you could never do. Your chapter in my life is over. Grace's heart shattered into pieces, but her spirit refused to break. She picked up the pen with trembling hands, signed her name, and walked away with quiet dignity. David and Ruth celebrated her departure as if it were a victory. They toasted to their new beginning, while Grace left the mansion that had once been her home. She carried nothing but a small bag of clothes, her Bible clutched tightly to her chest. That night, in her small rented room, she wept bitterly, feeling abandoned by everyone, even God. But as she lay there, exhausted from her grief, she felt something stir within her body, something she hadn't felt in years. Weeks later, a doctor's visit confirmed what seemed impossible. Grace was pregnant. The news filled her with indescribable joy. For the first time in years, she felt vindicated. God had answered her prayers at the very moment her enemies thought she was finished. Grace's pregnancy was not easy. She had no husband to support her, no family to lean on, and barely enough money to survive. Yet her faith became her strength. Each day, she whispered words of hope to the life growing inside her. You are my miracle, she told her unborn child. You are proof that God's time is always perfect. Her belly grew steadily, and though neighbors whispered about her circumstances, she held her head high. She began to work small jobs, sewing clothes and selling food, determined to provide for her child. Slowly, she built a new life, one that was humble but filled with peace. Months later, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Samuel. The moment she held him in her arms, she wept tears of joy. He had David's eyes, David's smile, and David's dimple. But unlike Abigail, Samuel was truly his blood. Grace named him Samuel, meaning God has heard, because he was the answer to her long-awaited prayers. Every night, she held him close, singing hymns and telling him stories of God's faithfulness. She vowed to raise him with love and strength, determined never to let him suffer as she had. Little did she know, Samuel's existence would one day shake David's world to its very core. While Grace was embracing her new life, Ruth was hiding a secret that threatened to shatter hers. Abigail, the child she paraded as David's pride, was not his at all. Her true father was Michal, Ruth's former lover. Ruth had rekindled her affair with Michal while married to David, believing he would never find out. But Michal, A cunning man with little shame wanted recognition for his child. He began pressuring Ruth to acknowledge him, demanding money and threatening to reveal the truth. Ruth panicked. She knew David's pride hinged entirely on Abigail being his heir. If the truth ever came out, everything she had schemed for would crumble in an instant. One evening, Michael appeared at David's house unannounced. Ruth's blood ran cold when she saw him standing at the door, demanding to see Abigail. "She's my daughter, and I won't be hidden any longer," he declared. David, stunned, demanded an explanation. Ruth stammered, her lies crumbling under Michael's relentless accusations. The truth spilled out, leaving David in utter disbelief. His world collapsed around him as he realized he had been deceived, parading another man's child as his own. His chest tightened, his knees buckled, and for the first time in years, he felt powerless. The man who had mocked Grace's forbearance had been mocked by fate itself. The revelation of Ruth's betrayal crushed David. He locked himself in his study for days, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. The image of Abigail's innocent face tormented him, not because she was at fault, but because she was living proof of his humiliation. His pride, once towering, lay in ruins. Ruth begged for forgiveness, but David could not look at her without seething anger. The household that had once been filled with laughter now echoed with silence and tension. Business partners noticed his decline, rumors spread, and his once solid reputation began to crack. Meanwhile, Ruth's arrogance turned to desperation. She tried everything to win back David's favor, but nothing worked. He withdrew his affection, stopped providing her with luxuries, and treated her as though she were invisible. She turned to Michael for comfort, but even he grew tired of her manipulations. Alone and disgraced, Ruth realized that her greed had destroyed the very life she had fought to steal. David, on the other hand, drowned himself in regret. Memories of Grace haunted him, her patience, her prayers, her quiet dignity. He realized too late that he had thrown away the one woman who had truly loved him. Months later, David tried to rebuild his shattered life. He resumed work, forced smiles in public, and pretended to move on. But deep inside, he was hollow. Then came that fateful day at the mall when he saw Grace again, holding Samuel's hand. The boy's resemblance to him was undeniable. His heart raced as he watched them walk away, and 1,000 regrets flooded his mind. He wanted to run after them, to fall at Grace's feet and beg forgiveness. But pride, that old enemy, held him back. That night, David lay awake in bed, tormented by the memory of Samuel's face. He knew he had to see Grace again. He needed answers. The next day, he hired someone to discreetly follow her, to learn where she lived and what her life had become. When he discovered that Grace lived modestly, raising Samuel alone with dignity and strength, his heart broke even more. He realized she had given him the very gift he had accused her of being incapable of giving, a child. His soul ached with regret, and for the first time, David began to pray, whispering words he had never meant before. "God, give me a second chance." David finally gathered the courage to approach Grace. He went to her small home one quiet evening, his heart pounding with fear and hope. When she opened the door, she froze, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Samuel peeked from behind her, clutching her dress. David's throat tightened at the sight. "Grace, please, I just want to talk," he pleaded. She hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly, allowing him in. The room was simple but warm, filled with Samuel's drawings and the comforting aroma of home-cooked food. David felt ashamed, remembering the mansion he had cast her out from, where she had been treated like a maid. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Finally, he blurted out, "Is he mine?" Grace looked him dead in the eyes, her expression a mixture of pain and defiance. "Yes," she said firmly, but not anymore. The word struck David like a dagger. She went on, her voice steady. "You lost that right the day you abandoned me, the day you mocked me, the day you let Ruth humiliate me. Samuel is my son, and I will raise him without your help." David's eyes filled with tears, but Grace turned away, unwilling to let him see her own pain. For the first time in his life, David realized the true cost of his pride. He had gained nothing and lost everything. David walked home that night with his heart heavy, the echo of Grace's words pounding in his ears. Yes, but not anymore. He replayed those words endlessly, realizing they were more than just a rejection. They were a verdict. Samuel was his son, yet Grace was right. He had forfeited the privilege of fatherhood long ago. As he lay in bed, Memories of his cruelty replayed like tormenting visions. The insults, the slammed doors, the divorce papers he had forced into her trembling hands. He wept silently, knowing that he could never erase the scars he left on her heart. His wealth, his pride, even his name, none of it mattered anymore. He longed only for redemption, but he wasn't sure if God, let alone Grace, would ever grant him that. Meanwhile, Grace sat by Samuel's bed, watching him sleep peacefully. Her heart was conflicted. She had told David the truth, yet she had also built walls around herself to keep him away. Part of her longed to let Samuel know his father, but she remembered the years of abuse, the loneliness, and the betrayal. She reminded herself that Samuel deserved peace, not the chaos David would bring. Grace prayed that night for strength, whispering, "Lord, help me raise this child without bitterness." Though she had shut the door on David, deep inside, the wound he left still bled quietly. While David wrestled with regret, Ruth's life unraveled rapidly. After her secret was exposed, her reputation plummeted. Friends who had once envied her now mocked her behind her back. Business partners whispered about the scandal, and David's coldness became unbearable. Abigail, innocent at all, became her only comfort. But even then, Ruth feared Michael would one day try to take her away. Desperation turned her bitter, and she lashed out at everyone around her. She begged David for forgiveness, swearing she had been blinded by weakness, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. He treated her as though she were invisible, speaking only when necessary, and even then with disdain. Michael, once so eager to be part of Abigail's life, grew tired of Ruth's constant emotional demands. His visits became infrequent, and soon he disappeared entirely, leaving her alone with the shame of her choices. Ruth spiraled into depression, her once proud arrogance replaced by despair. One night, staring into the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She remembered the day she had agreed to marry David, the thrill of stealing her sister's place, the excitement of wearing expensive fabrics. Now, all that remained was emptiness. For the first time, Ruth realized that envy had destroyed not only Grace but herself as well. Unable to silence his guilt, David returned to Grace's home again, this time during the day. Samuel was outside playing with other children, his laughter echoing in the air. David's chest tightened with longing. He approached Grace cautiously, who was tending to laundry in the backyard. She stiffened the moment she saw him, her eyes guarded. "Why are you here again?" she asked flatly. David swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. "Grace, please. Give me a chance to be part of his life. I know I don't deserve it, but he's my son. I beg you." His voice cracked, his pride shattered entirely. Grace turned away, her hands gripping the clothesline tightly. She thought of all the years she had begged for kindness, all the nights she had prayed for a husband's love, only to be mocked and humiliated. Now he wanted to claim what he had once thrown away. "David," she said slowly, "I raised Samuel without you. I carried him alone, birthed him alone, and fed him alone. Where were you when I was too weak to stand? Where were you when I cried into my pillow, praying for strength?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice was firm. "You don't get to walk back into our lives as if nothing happened." David broke down, sinking to his knees, but Grace remained unmoved. Though Grace tried to shield Samuel, children have a way of sensing truths hidden from them. He had noticed how David looked at him, how their features mirrored one another. One evening, as Grace tucked him into bed, Samuel asked innocently, "Mama, who is that man that comes sometimes? Why does he look like me?" Grace froze, her heart pounding. She had dreaded this moment. She sat on the edge of the bed, brushing his hair gently. "That man is someone from the past," she said softly. But Samuel pressed on. "Is he my father?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. She had promised herself she would tell him the truth one day, but she never imagined it would come so soon. "Yes," she whispered finally. Samuel's eyes widened with curiosity rather than anger. "Why isn't he here with us?" Grace's throat tightened. "Because he made choices that hurt us, choices that broke our family. But Samuel, you are loved. You are enough." The boy nodded slowly, but Grace could see the storm of questions forming in his young mind. That night, she wept silently, realizing that no matter how hard she tried, the past would always bleed into their present. Ruth's despair drove her to reckless actions. One afternoon, she stormed into Grace's home uninvited, her eyes wild, her hair unkempt. Grace was startled, Samuel clinging to her leg as Ruth shouted accusations. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you're better than me because you carried his son," she screamed. Grace stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "Ruth, leave my home. You've done enough damage." But Ruth was beyond reason. She ranted about how unfair life had been, how Grace always seemed to rise while she fell. "You ruined me, Grace. You made me look like a fool." Grace's heart ached at the sight of her once vibrant sister reduced to madness. "Ruth, I never wish you harm," she said quietly. "Your choices ruined you, not me." Ruth's face twisted with rage as she lunged forward, but Grace shielded Samuel and called for neighbors, who rushed in to restrain her. Ruth broke down sobbing, collapsing to the floor as her anger dissolved into sorrow. Grace, despite everything, knelt beside her. "I forgive you, Ruth," she whispered. Ruth looked at her in shock, unable to comprehend such mercy. It was a moment that revealed the vast difference between the two sisters, one ruled by envy, the other by grace. After witnessing Ruth's collapse and hearing of her outburst, David's heart shattered further. He realized the ripple effect of his choices had destroyed not just his marriage, but the entire family. He had allowed Ruth into their lives, enabling her betrayal, and in doing so, he had broken both women. For the first time, he fully saw the depth of Grace's patience, the strength she had shown in enduring what no one else could. He visited his church quietly, kneeling alone at the altar. Tears streamed down his face as he prayed sincerely for the first time in years. "God, forgive me. Forgive my pride, my blindness, my cruelty. If there is still a chance, restore what I destroyed." The pastor who found him there listened to his confession with gentle wisdom. He reminded David that forgiveness was possible, but reconciliation was a journey, not a demand. "You cannot force her to return," the pastor said. "You can only show through your actions that you are no longer the man you once were." David nodded, understanding that words alone would not heal the wounds. He left the church with a new resolve. If he could not win Grace back as a wife, he would at least prove himself worthy as a father to Samuel. David began showing up at Samuel's school, quietly paying his fees and leaving small notes of encouragement. He helped with repairs at Grace's home without her asking, hiring workers to fix the leaky roof and mend the broken gate. At first, Grace resisted, her pride unwilling to accept his help. But over time, she saw that his efforts were consistent, not the fleeting gestures of a guilty man. Samuel noticed too. "Mama, he fixed the swing at school," he said one evening, his eyes bright with excitement. "He watches me play soccer. Why can't he come home with us?" Grace struggled with her emotions. She didn't want Samuel to be disappointed if David failed again, yet she couldn't ignore the changes she saw. David was no longer the arrogant man who had mocked her faith. He was quieter, humbler, almost broken in a way that made him human again. One afternoon, she found him sitting outside their home, watching Samuel play with other children. His eyes glistened with pride and sadness. "He's amazing, Grace," he whispered. For the first time in years, she saw sincerity in his eyes. It frightened her, because it reminded her of the man she had once fallen in love with. Realizing she had no place left in David's life, Ruth packed her belongings and left the city with Abigail. She sent one final message to Grace. "I'm sorry." It was short, but Grace knew it carried years of bitterness, envy, and regret. Ruth's absence brought a strange peace to everyone. David no longer had to endure her presence, and Grace no longer had to fear her manipulations. Still, Grace prayed for her sister, hoping she would find healing wherever life led her. Abigail, innocent in all this, deserved better than the chaos her mother had caused. David, though relieved, was also haunted. He had destroyed Ruth's future as much as his own, but he chose not to dwell on her anymore. His focus shifted entirely to Samuel and Grace. He knew he could not erase the past, but perhaps he could build a new chapter. He began joining them for church services, sitting quietly at the back while Grace and Samuel sat in front. Slowly, the community began to notice the change. Some whispered, others judged, but Grace kept her heart guarded. She knew the road to forgiveness was long, and she wasn't ready to let David back in so easily. Grace found herself torn between two emotions, lingering anger and growing compassion. She watched David with Samuel, saw how the boy's eyes lit up whenever his father appeared, and her heart softened. Yet, the scars of the past kept her cautious. One evening, Samuel asked, "Mama, can Daddy live with us?" The question pierced her like a knife. She smiled gently and said, "Not yet, my son. Some things take time." Samuel pouted, but nodded, trusting her words. Grace, however, lay awake that night, wrestling with her conscience. Could she ever truly forgive David? Could she risk her heart again? David, on the other hand, waited patiently. He no longer demanded, no longer pushed. He served quietly, hoping that his actions would one day speak louder than his past sins. He knew Grace's heart was like a locked door, and only time and true repentance could open it. The love he once took for granted now seemed like the greatest treasure he could ever hope to win back. His greatest fear, however, was that he had come too late. Months passed, and David continued to prove his sincerity. Samuel grew closer to him, and even Grace began to lower her guard. One Sunday morning after church, Samuel grabbed both their hands and pulled them together. "I want us to be a family," he said simply. The innocence in his eyes melted the walls Grace had built. She looked at David, who stood silently, tears glistening in his eyes. For the first time in years, she saw not the arrogant man who had hurt her, but the broken soul who longed for forgiveness. Grace took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "David," she said softly, "I cannot forget the past. But for Samuel's sake, and because I see the change in you, I will try." David fell to his knees, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you, Grace. I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of this chance." Samuel clapped joyfully, hugging them both. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Grace whispered prayer in her heart. "Lord, you make all things new." And with that, their story of pain began to transform into a story of redemption, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal with time, faith, and love. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.